Tell me a little bit about how you got into that. What started this journey into writing, and just whatever you want. This is kind of this is a friendly crowd, and there are a lot of writers. How many writers do we have here? Oh yeah, lots of writers. So I think a lot of people just want to know, how did you become Brandon Sanderson?
Okay, that's a long story. If you're familiar with my books, I'm used to long stories.
We're thankful for it.
I have a fun start to this in that I was not a reader when I was young. I really liked books when I was in like 2nd and 3rd grade. I can remember the 3 Investigators novels. I read a bunch of those. But I fell out of reading. We find that in literacy professionals find that boys often do fall out of reading right around 5th, 6th, 7th grade. It's kind of a trouble area, and that happened to me. For me, I always joked it was that people kept giving me books about boys with pet dogs, and then the pet dog would die, and then they were sad, and I'm like, this is what literature is? I still hate dogs? I'm so tired of this. And this has become almost, a running gag among authors, because it happens to a lot of us. Is they're like, okay, no more dead dogs, please. And I don't know what it was, honestly. I did not read. I tried Tolkien. And while I like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings is not a good book to give a reluctant reader who's reading below his grade level. I bounced off that like bouncing off Isaiah. It was just like a brick wall, and I'm like, what? And so I didn't read very much for a few years until I was in 8th grade. And this is true, my teacher's name was Ms. Reader. She's now on the faculty at UC Irvine. And this was in Nebraska. And she's Ms. Reader. She picked up on the fact that I was not reading at my grade level, and I had learned to fake my way through book reports, which is not too hard. You're kind of a clever kid, and you can see, hey, books have summaries on the backs. And if you read the summary and a few pages at the end that the summary doesn't give away, then you can do a book report. She knew I was doing this, so she made me go to the old ratty cart she had, full of, teachers have these, right? The paperbacks that 100 kids have read, and they're like stained with spaghetti stains from school lunch and stuff. And she's like, these are some of the books on the top shelf here that I have read recently. I want you to read one of these, and then you can tell me about it, and that'll be your book report, right? Well, I'll interview you about it. And then I'm like, oh no, she'll know, because I only read the back. What do I do? So I was kind of pushed into actually selecting a book, so I browsed through those, and I happened upon a book called Dragon's Bane by Barbara Hambly, which is this really great standalone fantasy novel. And it had a dragon on the cover, which is a plus. It also had a pretty girl on the cover. It's a big plus when you're a 14-year-old boy. And so I'm like, okay. And then there's like some guy who looks pretty cool. He's wearing goggles. Goggles are cool. And so I picked up the book and I read it, and I just fell in love with it. And a lot of people often ask me what was about this book that worked for you, because it is not the traditional book you would give to someone in my place. Number one, it stars a middle-aged woman. That's the protagonist. The story is there's this guy who had slain a dragon when he was young and in his 20s, and then she married him. She practices the magic in the world, and he got tired of like the dragon hunting life or whatever, and they retired up into the northern part of the country, and now he raises pigs, and she works on her magic. Just kind of, fiddles around with it. That's their life. And then someone shows up from the center of the kingdom and says, a dragon is burning down everything and destroying everything. You're the only living dragon slayer. Can you come down and kill the dragon for us? And the guy's like, I'm 50. You don't kill dragons when you're 50. And she's like, you're 50. You can't go kill dragons. But they decide they need to save the kingdom, and they go down to save the kingdom, but they're like, we have to do it way differently. Instead of riding up on a horse with a sword, how do we do this? And so they construct giant crossbows and stuff. It's like, the wily older person taking down a dragon instead of the young jock. And it was a really fun book. That was part of it. It was taking me to this wonderful place, and then it was approaching the story from a direction that was really interesting to me. I think if it had just been a standard Dragon Slayer story, I might have been bored by that too, I'm not sure. But it was taking a really different approach on this. And then it had a third thing. So my mom, she graduated first in her class, BYU in accounting, in a year where she was the only woman in a lot of her accounting classes. And she got all these prestigious scholarships. And she actually set those aside to have me, right? And as a teenager, I always thought, well, of course she did, right? Look at me. This is what you do, you know, when you're going to have an awesome son. And in the book, the main character has had a lifelong struggle between how much time she spends on her family and how much time she spends on her magic. And all through the book, I'm like, ditch those kids, go use your magic. Magic is cool. And it's really kind of her midlife crisis, paralleling this invasion of a dragon and things like that. And again, a 14-year-old boy, midlife crisis, you know, of a mother. But I got done with that book, I'm like, I understand my mom better, right? I get, you know, maybe a little bit of what she went through to put some of her career on hold to have me. And it was this weird situation where I got something wondrous, I got something unexpected, and I got a deep personal connection all in one story. And that's what made me say I have to read this fantasy stuff. And I just went to the books, the library there in the middle school, and I'm like, what do you got about dragons? Give me stuff with dragons. And so my next foray was the Anne McCaffrey Dragon Rise of Fern series, which if you haven't read, they're just amazing. Hugo Award-winning, fantastic stories. And that kind of cemented me as a fan of fantasy literature. That sense of wonder I found was vital to me. I can read and enjoy other books still, and I do try to read outside my genre, but it has to take me to a new place. To really engage me, I find that it's that sense of exploration. There's something inside me that wants to explore, but it also has to, you know, be grounded in character. The character, I have to make a personal connection with some people in these stories, and I think, you know, that's the power that specifically fantasy has, is it can blend those two things. But that's the power of books in general. So they let us see through the eyes of people who are not like ourselves. And maybe make a personal connection with somebody that you know, it's like somebody who's on another continent, who's written this story down, and you get to understand them better. It's a really cool thing.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to pull on this thread a little bit. So you're talking about characters.
Yeah.
How much of yourself do you see in these characters? Are there any that you just say, wow, this is I'm feeling a little bit more like so-and-so. Are there any that you just loathe and despise? Maybe kind of reflect on both sides of this.
Yeah.
And then we can maybe think about how you maybe share with them how you come up with these characters and how much you sketch out and how much you just kind of go with it.
Good questions. Yeah. So for me, characters are one of the hardest ones to talk about. If you don't know a lot about creative writing philosophy, one of the quick breakdowns we often make to explain how different writers work is a lot of writers fall into one of two camps. They either fall into what we call discovery writers, or they fall into what we call outline writers. George Martin has a way of talking this. He calls them gardeners or architects. Now, like anything like this, most people are a continuum somewhere between, or they change based on the book they're writing. But how much you outline versus how much you just kind of figure out on the fly is a big part of how your writing process works. And for me, I've always been a bit more of an outliner. So outlining classically creates explosive endings, and a good sense of momentum through the story. Those are like your big advantages of outline writing. Character writing, you generally are able to create characters who feel more real. That's one of the strengths of the characterization, and you generally are able to create a more realistic sense of place. And so, you know, these tools do different things, and of course you kind of mix and match. So what I really try to do is I try to outline my setting a lot, really what everything's looking like, outline my plot a moderate amount, and then discovery write my character. What this leads me to be able to do is really explain how a plot works and how to break down a plot. But a character is done for me a lot more on instinct. I will usually try to use some classic discovery writer methods. So discovery writers, how a lot of discovery writers work is they will start doing monologues by the character, just in first person, even if the book isn't in first person, to have the character kind of explain their life to you. Just an average everyday life, to try and capture their voice and their motives and things like this. Discovery writers will often, Stephen King is a classic discovery writer. So if you read a lot of Stephen King, you probably recognize great sense of place, really awesome, interesting characters, complete endings that completely fall apart. That's what happens with a lot of discovery writing. But a lot of the thriller writers and things, you can notice great endings, great sense of pace all the way through them. Characters feel like they're cardboard. And are completely interchangeable. You can kind of tell what someone is anyway. So my goal is to try to blend these methods. And a lot of writers do this. I'm not the only one. But with what Stephen King does, he says, I try to make someone really interesting at odds with their environment and put them into an extreme situation, either emotionally or extreme, something really bizarre is happening. And then I let them go. And I follow them as they try to find their way through this really, really weird situation, or this extreme emotional situation. And that often creates some real character power and empathy as you're naturally writing this character who, in some ways, is as confused by the world as you are. In some ways, the character knows more than you do because you're seeing everything through their lens. So for me, in designing characters, I'm often looking for their conflict. What is driving life? Not their conflict, plot conflict. Not, oh no, the world's going to end conflict. My father wants me to be a surgeon, but I've always really wanted to be a soldier. He said, that conflict, which is one of the core conflicts from the Stormlight Archive, is this guy who wants to, he thinks he'd make a really good soldier. When he goes, he is really a good soldier, but his dad has always been like, do no harm, do no harm, do no harm. You're a healer, let other people do harm. This sort of thing, and that kind of contrast inside of him. One of your initial questions was, how much of me is in this? And so, and I think you'll find this ubiquitous among writers. There's a little bit of me in every character, and something that is intentionally not me, so that I can try and explore what it is to be someone other than myself. That's what we do, right? And so, using the example of the surgeon, I had a bit of that in that my dear mother, whom I love, the accountant, she wanted me to be a doctor. And I got into this fantasy stuff, she supported it. She was great. A lot of parents during the 80s, when their kids started doing things like role-playing games and stuff, there was a huge panic. Some other mothers would ask my mom, you're letting them play that game? She's like, come look, they're with other people. Instead of sitting in his room by himself, he has 3 friends and a pizza, and they're talking about killing orcs. I don't get it, but he's there with his friends. And his friends are good kids, and they're in my basement. She loved that we came to her house, and we did this. And she knew that we weren't out somewhere else, and so she just kept us in as much pizza and Mountain Dew as was physically possible, and let us do our little gaming thing. But she did want a doctor. She really wanted a doctor. And she has 4 kids, and she got no doctors. And she tried on all of us, but my mother's she's now the head accountant for the city of Idaho Falls electric department. And she just is amazing. And she's one of these forces that, she enters a room and then everything changes. It somehow is not only cleaner, but it also wants to stand up straighter and wants to go and make sure that it makes a good living doing something respectable, right?
This is for you, Mom. This goes viral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she really wanted a doctor. And what she said to me, she said, oh, Brandon, you know how doctors all go play golf? What if instead of playing golf, you went and wrote your books, and then you had the whole doctoring thing, to be a career? And my mom's a smart woman, and so I tried that out. I went to BYU as a chemistry major. And I lasted 1 year, and then I went on my mission to Korea, Seoul West, and I was so glad to be on another continent for chemistry. Chemistry was terrible, but I really missed the writing. In fact, I got permission from my mission president to work on my stories on P days while everyone was playing basketball. I had an hour to sit with a little notepad and jot down ideas. And I came out of that mission where you just don't have any time, saying the thing that I missed giving up the most was the time to write. And I hadn't before that spent really any more time than that. An hour a day would have been a lot for me. You're a teenager and things. I probably spent way less than that, or not an hour a week, I mean. But on my mission, an hour a week felt like vital, precious time. So I got back and I'm like, I've been wasting my life. I'm going to write books. So I got a job working a graveyard shift at a hotel where nobody would bother me because it was right next to BYU, and late check-ins are like at 10:15. Right after that, it's just empty. And so I would work. I would write books from midnight till 5 a.m. on the front desk computers using a floppy disk. Because I didn't have my own computer. Overnight, every night while I went to BYU. And so you asked about this character. Well, there's part of me that, the parent who wants you to be something, and you feel you've got something else that you need to be. And that conflict is a very personal conflict to me. I've never been a field surgeon, right? And it's a very different experience. The big part of Kaladin that is a soldier, that's something new for me to explore. But the core relationship came from me. And you find that as an author, you do this a lot. As for characters I like more or less than others, it doesn't really work that way for me. Whoever I'm writing right now is the most important character to me, and I have to be able to see through their eyes, see the world the way they do. And I can't hate any of my characters. I have to, when I am writing them, I have to be seeing things the way they see them. And there are some self-loathing characters, so I suppose in that case, but really it's my books and my characters are all my children. I don't play favorites, I just try to do the best by them I can.
Fantastic. Along those lines, you put characters in extreme peril. Very difficult situations. Kaladin is a good example of Way of Kings, where you just say, how could things get worse? And then they do. And
you just described how to write fiction. Nobody needs my class at BYU.
There you go.
You didn't take that line.
There you go. And they're just these gripping dramas because you're saying you feel for them. What motivated that? Were you beat up as a child? How do you create these people who are just in intense conflict? Whether it's a religious situation that's been handed down from many generations and come out, or whether it's a monarch who just has some issues with the way things are written. What motivates this, or is this all out of your head? Does this come out of your head?
So this is how do we do this? Well, practice, right? If you want to be a great writer, you practice a lot, you observe a lot, and you try to capture on the page the things that you see in the world around you. So for instance, if you go to a great painter and say, how do you capture this expression of grief, on the face of this character who's just killed their son, right? How did you do this? And did you feel this? And we all have pain. We all have things we can draw upon. But I had a very good childhood. I want to dispel the myth that artists are all tortured beings who are alcoholics, and you have to whatever. Like, I had a really good childhood. The worst parts about my childhood were my mom saying, you got a B in this class, and I know you could get an A. Well, she's telling my brother who got a B, good job. right? And I'm like, that's not fair. She's like, it is fair, I say so. That's like the hardest thing of my, not hard at all. My life was very nice, very privileged. And I had a good experience at BYU. I had some of the classic teenager, I don't fit in stuff, as we all do, but I have no, I'm very emotionally and mentally stable. I actually have been blessed with extreme emotional stability. It's really interesting. I compare and talk to some people that I love, and they're like this, right? And I am just like this every day. I get up every day feeling about the same. I have no, it's really weird, right? It happens. There's a lot of us that do this, but we don't speak out because we feel so guilty because everybody else is like, right? Where we're just like, you're all weirdos, right? Sam the Eagle, is that the guy? You're all a bunch of weirdos. And so people who know me emotionally and things would be like, why are you the writer, right? You're not the one who experiences all of this stuff, but I would hope that I'm a really good observer and a great painter captures that expression and says, I'm going to find a place to express this in my paintings. And for me, I read a lot, I listen a lot, I read a lot of nonfiction, and I look for these moments, these kind of crisis moments, and try to say, well, what would it feel like? And I think empathy is like the ultimate thing we can learn as writers, as readers, is that. And so I try to look for it, and I write in a genre, which is generally, I write in not just fantasy, I write epic fantasy. And what the definition of epic fantasy, this is, Grandpa Tolkien kicked off this genre. Epic fantasy is a different world, fantastical different world. It is kind of extremes of character interaction. The world is in grave danger, or some, you put, it's a clash on epic scale, and lots of magic. And in my books, I like to kind of explore magic as physics, right? And so you've got these sorts of things. For those who haven't read the Stormlight Archive, the premise for the planet is I wanted to tell a world where the world got hit with this enormous, category 10. They only got to 5, but category 10 hurricane every 5 or 6 days. And this is really relevant right now. I don't mean to sound tone deaf. A lot of people are suffering from this right now in our world. But this is what started this off. I'm like, how would we deal with an environment that extreme? And how would human civilization survive in a world where, if you go out during one of these things, you just get blown off. Boulders are thrown. Humankind has to survive. How would the ecology of a world survive this? And that's our extreme environment, right? And then try to put as real a people as I can create into this environment that you read and you're like, this is just like me or just like people I know, and explore how we act under extreme circumstances. That's the idea behind epic fantasy.
Fantastic. You said something about magic and physics.
Yes.
How much reading of science do you do? Is that chemistry thing still kind of lingering in your background?
I read a lot of pop science, but what you've got to understand is the big difference between science fiction and fantasy, at least as defined by me. I love both genres. What science fiction tries to do is it tries to take what we have right now and extrapolate to the plausible that's just not possible right now. Classic example of this was Arthur C. Clarke, great science fiction writer, who did a lot of work in mathematics and worked with a lot of people, and then put geosynchronous satellites into his books years before we actually managed to launch one, right? With science fiction, when he put it in his book, we had them a number of years later. And this is what a lot of science fiction people try to do. Now, some science fiction is what we call social science fiction, and it is trying to extrapolate, where we could potentially go if certain social dynamics happened. Harrison Bergeron's a great example. This by Kurt Vonnegut, where he postulates a world where, in order to make everyone equal, if you're too smart, they install a bell inside your ear to interrupt your thoughts every certain number of seconds, so that no one can be more intelligent than anyone else. That's social science fiction. and stuff. But yeah, generally the idea is we try to go take what we have and go plausibly upward. Fantasy, in my opinion, what we do is we start with the impossible, and then we try as hard as we can to make it feel plausible. So we're working the opposite direction back. And so with me building these magic systems in these worlds, the idea is to say, what would happen in our world if X, Y, or Z could happen? This completely impossible thing. What effect would that have on us? The storms are an example. These are magical storms. In order to build this world the way I built it, these two things just have to be, they have to defy the laws of our physics to exist. We put that in place and we take that leap. And then we say, all right, let's make it feel plausible. When you read the book, make it feel like, because it's important to the characters, that it just really could happen. And I do that with the magic in my books. So I believe it was Arthur C. Clarke that said, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. This is a famous quote, the idea that if someone from 3,000 years ago came forward, our cell phones would just be magic to them. We kind of take the reverse in my subgenre of fantasy, which is any sufficiently explained magic becomes indistinguishable from science. The idea is that if you go in the book and some of these weird things happen, at least for me, you should be able to measure them, and you should be able to kind of start to figure out how this all works. But there's a fundamental leap there. We break the laws of thermodynamics. You just can't fudge those and have it be plausible, or impossible, I mean, yeah.
Mistborn takes really, you have several different competing levels of magic, systems of magic, right?
Yeah.
So how did you come up with it? I mean, do you just stay up at night, think, I wonder what this is?
Oh yeah. So
what did you do?
they come off from all over the place. So I can talk a little bit about this. Mistborn, the earliest idea for Mistborn, and you can kind of see in the mind of a fantasy novelist how this happens. I am an insomniac. I work at night, I got that graveyard shift. Even in high school, I did not sleep well at nights, and I was often tired in class. And then I would go home and go to bed, and I couldn't fall asleep. And I remember sitting in class once, just miserable, thinking, wow, I wish I could somehow store up all my sleepiness and then use it later on to fall asleep. If there were like some device that could suck it all out for me right now and then stick it all back in my brain 8 hours later and I just fall asleep, right? Years later, I developed a magic system that is based on that. In Mistborn, one of the people, he has the ability, if he wants to, he can be twice as strong as he is now. But first, he has to store up his strength and be half as strong. So he's really weak for a while. He stores up this power inside of a device, and then he grabs it right at the moment, and boom, twice as strong. And so it's this idea behind delayed gratification, right? And this idea behind, can we train ourselves to be abstemious in our lives for later, to gain something later on. And that magic system became a big part of those books. And I designed magic to go around with it. And it's just, these things come from places like that. Little points in my life where there's something I wish could happen, or I read about something in science, or sometimes it's just designed for the book. And there's another one, and it's really weird for those who read fantasy. It'll make sense if you read the book, but people can move pieces of metal around with their brains. Right? What they do is they usually throw a coin, and then they can shove it away from themselves, or they can pull it toward themselves, right toward their center of gravity. And if it hits something heavier than you, you're thrown backward. And if it hits something lighter than you, you can shove it off with using the piece of metal. And so it allows for a lot of very fun interplay where someone drops a coin and shoots upward, or you're wearing some metal so they grab onto something and grab you and pull you toward them. It allows for a lot of action sequences. It's very fun. And I designed that one specifically to match the needs of my story, whereas the other one kind of came through for years of something I wished I could do, and I found a place for it. This one I said, well, I'm going to be telling a story. Mistborn, for those who don't know, is the story about a gang of thieves. It's kind of a modernist fantasy story because I was reading Harry Potter And I'm like, wow, these Dark Lords never get a break, right? Poor Voldemort. He gets taken down by this dopey kid who can't even pass his classes. It's not even Hermione who gets it, right? It's Harry, the power of the heart, whatever. I love the Harry Potter books, but and I was thinking about Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, you're the Dark Lord Sauron. You can take on anybody. Who is it that defeats you? Not Gandalf. It's the furry-footed British kid. Who goes up and throws your ring in the hole, and you're like, what? This isn't fair. And so I thought, what if you got to the end of Lord of the Rings, and Sauron's like, oh, hey, thanks for bringing my ring back. I've been looking for that. And then, took over the world. And Mistborn's concept is a world where the Dark Lord won, where Voldemort won, or Sauron won, or something like this. It takes place 1,000 years later, and this gang of thieves is like, all right, all those prophecies about a hero who'd save us, well, that didn't work out, did it? Oh, we lost. And now an immortal Dark Lord's in control. Let's rob this guy silly, bribe his armies away from him, overthrow the Empire, take half the money, run off and be wealthy. We've done a good deed, and we're rich. It's kind of like if Star Wars were all Han Solo's ideas, right? And so I needed a set of magical talents that would help a classic thieving crew, where you have your strong guy, you have your face, you have your, your sneaky guy, you have this whole team, and I built a group of powers that would enhance each of them, so they could be a team, kind of like a heist story, but each of their talents are magically enhanced. And so that's where that came from.
That's fantastic. So, I did ask for some questions ahead of time, and one person said, what I enjoy the most is how deeply good many of the protagonists are in a completely believable and non-naive way, which is, by the way, very hard to do, right? Because it's easy to have somebody that you just say, oh, well, that's a priesthood, if you will, pardon that reference, but basically they're just perfect. But you have some people who have some issues, and yet they still are able to persist. So how does that connect with your LDS background?
Right.
Or is that just something you grew up with? How did you come up with some of these characters?
So this is the type of stories I always loved. I like reading about someone who is deep down a good person. And sometimes the people disagree on what's good. And you'll see a lot of the antagonists in my books are people who have, my very first book, the story was about a missionary. The antagonist is a missionary who's doing missionary stuff for all the wrong reasons. But he's sincere, because anyway. The idea is I think people are innately good. It's also nice because the epic fantasy genre took a turn toward very much shades of gray. The most popular epic fantasy of my era is Game of Thrones. And George made a career of, everyone is somewhat despicable, but I'm going to show you how they're sympathetically despicable. George is a very good writer, but there's always a sense of despair in George's books. And he did that, if you haven't read the first one, a little bit of spoilers, but he did that by taking the person who would be the protagonist in most fantasy stories, and then having it look like this guy is going to become the protagonist of this, and then halfway through, or third of the way through, killing him in a miserable way, and just saying, no, this is a book where that person who's an idealist just gets stomped. And that's actually an advantage to me because my style of writing is a little bit more in the classic C.S. Lewis Tolkien style, kind of updated to modern fantasy storytelling. And so there was a place for me too. And a lot of things were going towards what George was writing. And I actually tried it out to see if I liked it before I got published, and I was terrible at it. I like that there's always a light of hope. And things get really bad a lot of times, but there is a light of hope. And it's not even a light of hope that you'll win, but it's a light of hope that says doing the right thing, even if some people take advantage of it, is ultimately still the right thing. It's kind of like one of the themes of what I try to do. And I try to have a lot of different characters take a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different things, but at its core, I want to write stories that are hopeful. And this is probably my LDS background as part. It certainly, that has something to do with it. It's my fiction upbringing. I loved reading The Wheel of Time, which is stories like that. Like The Wheel of Time is a story, Robert Jordan once, when he had to describe it in one sentence, said, what if you found out that you had to be the person who was going to save the world, and you were probably going to die doing it? What does that do to a person? And do you still go through with it? And so, yeah, I do think this is kind of intentional. Certainly I play off of the rest of the genre, but there's another thing in play here. And this is the idea that I feel as someone who is LDS and who writes, that I don't want to get moralistic. C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien had big discussions about this, sometimes big disagreements on whether you want your stories to be an allegory or not. And I fall on the side of not. I want my stories to be good stories that create, do all the great things. Create empathy, emotion, power, and at the end I'm a storyteller. I'm not an allegorist. I'm a storyteller. And I'm an entertainer. I hope you can learn something from it, but at my core this is what I'm doing. At the same time, I feel that there need to be good options, and if we don't write them and say, hey, these are good, you will enjoy these, then they just won't exist out there. If some of us didn't say, hey, like I said, I'm glad that the fantasy genre is open and there's lots of different things going on, but I'm going to write something that is as good as the things that have kind of the dark cast to them, but I want to have a light of hope in mind. And you know, it's this really difficult line, as you said, because, but I think you can be done. If you go back to the old war movies, some of the best war movies ever are really powerful, really intense, really emotional, and would have a PG rating today. You can't really make a war movie like that. I mean, you can't, but you're going to be PG-13 at least, probably are. But the old masters showed us it's possible. It's totally possible to have an adult story without what we would call adult content. And the problem we run into is if all of the stories we produce, we create, just avoid that completely and don't deal with these adult themes, then the only ones left will be the ones that have the adult themes and the adult content, and there will not be the options for people who want one but not the other. And so kind of this idea of not surrendering storytelling and entertainment to a segment who is, you know, doing great things, but maybe doing things that contain content that we may not want to experience. Does that make sense? I'm trying to talk around that because I really don't want to be down. I don't want to say to people, you shouldn't write the stories you want to write. And people in this room, if you want to write stories like that, I mean, art is art, and I don't want to be like one art is better than another art. I just know that what I want to create, I want something that fulfills that.
Right, and we see that in your books because you have these core elements of these characters that you just know it's going to work out, but it's going to be difficult in the end. Let's shift gears because I think a lot of people are interested in some of the mechanics of writing.
Okay.
Because now you've got your story, and it took you a little while to figure out how to get published, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of these people, how many of you are working on your first book? Okay, quite a few, yeah. So what advice would you give to them? Let's kind of go through like how many times did it take you to get a book published? Let's talk about maybe editor relationship, and maybe how you mix it up so you avoid burnout.
Okay.
Just kind of go.
That's a pretty rough set of questions there.
Yeah, exactly. Your softball. Nice softball.
All right. So let's start with
how'd you get started?
How did I get started? So classically, and again, people don't fit into boxes that we create very easily, but classically, outline writers tend to be the type who like to just write a whole bunch of books. The discovery writers tend to be the people who like to revise a book and revise a book ad nauseum, right? And so both groups kind of have problems getting published. This group, which is my group, tend to run through a whole bunch of different ideas, but never linger on one of them long enough to make it good enough to sell. You write a whole bunch of good stuff, nothing excellent. Whereas the discovery writers tend to fixate on one thing so long that it becomes over-workshopped and overwritten to the point that it becomes unpublishable because they aren't letting themselves try new things to expand their skills. You kind of look like, in a sports metaphor, this is the person that has practiced putting on this one green so well that they can putt that putt, but they just can't ever have a good game. And if they go to even a different putting green, they're in trouble, right? Whereas the outline writer tries 7 different sports, right? And every week is in a different league. And so what you've got to do is kind of find out what's your method and things like this. Just my personal story. I heard early on that your first few books are terrible. Your first 5 books, someone told me. Your first 5 books are doing terrible. You've probably heard versions of this. Your first 1,000,000 words or whatever are generally terrible. It's not necessarily true. Harry Potter was the first novel, though she did go through like 11 drafts on that before she sold it. But it still happens all the time that first novels get published and do very well. But I took that to heart because it was good for my psychology to hear that. That meant I didn't have to be like in performance mode on my books until my 6th book. And so I took 2 or 3 years, and I wrote 2 books a year because I was just off my mission, and I was like, I know how to organize my time and use it effectively, and I just took all that stuff and said, we're writing books now. And I specifically got the job working at the hotel so I could write, and I wrote 2 books a year for 3 years. And I wrote 6 novels, and the first 5 were all exploratory. I did a lot of different genres. They're all sci-fi fantasy, but I did if you know sci-fi fantasy, I did a cyberpunk, I did a space opera, I did 2 epic fantasies, and I did a comedic fantasy. Those were my first 5 books. At the end of all this, I said, okay, epic fantasy is where I want to be. I know that after exploring, I thought that it's where I would land, but I want to try all this stuff. I have my 5 terrible books out of me. I'm going to sit down and write my 6th book. And so I sat down and actually wrote Elantris, which is the book that finally sold. But I didn't have practice revising yet. I had ripped through those books and written them very quickly. And so when I submitted Elantris, it just started getting rejections while I was writing other books. And so I got it back, and over the next 4 or 5 years, what I learned is how to revise, how to work with a writing group, how to get beta readers and get them and actually learn from them the right things, finding beta readers who can give you advice that helps your book be a better version of the book you're trying to write, rather than who give you advice trying to change the book into something they would write. That's the big divide. And so a writing group or beta readers who can do that are invaluable. And over those years, I learned to do that. I wrote 13 novels before I sold one, and across about like a 9-year period. I eventually sold Elantris to Tor Books. This was in the days before ebooks, right before the big ebook revolution happened in 2010. It had been inching toward that, but 2010 was the big fire line. It's where everyone got Kindles for Christmas, and we made the big shift. I sold in 2003, and I came out in 2005. So it was still the traditional bookstore method, and self-publishing was just not a thing. Very, very rare. I mean, Richard Paul Evans did it, but that's about it. It took a huge investment of money to self-publish back then. And so I did traditional publishing. I went to conventions and conferences. I met editors. I listened to them on panels. I took notes. I made a little book, like a contact book of here's this editor at this publisher. Here's what they have edited. Here's what they seem to like. Here's some quotes of things they said on panels. This will let me target my books to the right people. In the meantime, I was learning to revise, and I did a lot of networking, and I eventually met some editors and was sending them books and getting personal rejections, and one of them finally picked up one of my books.
Fantastic. What advice would you have for somebody who works with an editor?
Yeah.
And what would you tell editors how they work with authors?
Well, I'll tell editors a couple things. First off, the best editors what do you call it? A copy edit versus a substantive edit, yeah. And those are very different things. I do not want my copy editor ever giving me substantive stuff. I want the copy editor finding out where someone's eyes were blue and changed. Like that's, but we don't send the book to them until we're ready for that. Substantive editor, remember to write down the good things too. Getting a manuscript that bleeds, even though you know it needs it, as a writer, every page is like a punch. And when you get, if you're marking the things that you like as well, it's really helpful just going through an edit, keeping your momentum up on that edit. It's very nice. And remember, your job is to find out and help the author make a better version of the book they wanted to write. And the editors I work with in New York are very good at this. Some people come to me from outside, and they're like, you know, and these are usually LDS people who are very maybe overly worried about things like this. We're like, oh, they're from New York. Don't they ask you to put lots of sex in your books and things? It happens. People ask that a lot. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay. There's a lot wrong with that question. But the answer that is the easiest is the editor wants you to make a better version of the book you're trying to tell. They're not going to try to take your book and make it into something it's not. They bought the book because they like it. They like your voice. They're going to try to help you express that. So, you know, when an editor may push me and say, you wrote this character to have lots of good comedic lines. The comedic lines are not good enough. Do better. They can do that, but they're not going to come and say, so try to make the book a better version. And as a writer, don't take it personally. And that's really hard to do, even if you've gotten feedback before. In fact, if you're in a writing group, your best thing to do is to stay quiet. Listen and treat your writing group like they are giving you audience feedback. You know, on like, let me give you an example. How much time do we have left?
About 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. So in Hollywood, they have this thing where they will show a test audience a bunch of pilots for sitcoms. You can go and you can be the test audience for it. And you're asked all these questions and things, and it's really fun, but the secret is the pilots are things they filmed 10 years ago that they're never planning to make into television shows. The advertisements between them are what they're actually testing you on. They want to see if the ads are effective, and they are watching exactly how you respond to those, and then trying to get feedback on the ads. And they've used the same sitcom pilots for years. And as a writer in a writing group or with beta readers, you want to be the fly on the wall who is just, you don't want to predispose them, you don't want to argue with them, you don't want to explain yourself. If it's not in the text, you didn't explain it well enough. Don't explain what you're trying to do. Listen to their feedback, write it down, decide if you want them confused or not, and if you don't, try explaining it and giving it to somebody else and see if they get it. But at the same time, don't take every bit of advice people say, particularly discovery writers. I've had too many students or people in writing groups who have come in and said, well, this writing group said it would be way better if it were a psychological thriller, and so I rewrote this chapter to be a psychological thriller. And you're like, the last chapter was a sweet Jane Austen-style romance. Psychological thriller is just not fitting anymore. Where'd the vampire come from? Oh, one person in my writing group told me vampires are really big right now, so I decided to put one in. That happens a lot more than you would think it does. You don't have to take every bit of advice, try to have a vision for a story.
Brandon, let's wrap up with one last question. The theme of this conference is the power of the word. Okay. Right? Mm-hmm. Words have power to unite or divide. You have that theme in several of your books. Could you just talk about the power of words in today's world?
Wow. I remember a time.
Life before death.
Yeah, life before death. I remember a time where the internet was coming along, and there was like this moment where everyone's like, people aren't going to need words anymore. Right? It's all turning into the World Wide Web. And everyone's moving toward sending pictures and emails and things like this. And there was this thought of we're not going to need words anymore. Turns out if you go look at the studies, people read more and need more use of the word, and have done so every year since the 50s. More, the percent is inched upward, the amount of reading people do every day. Now that we all carry an e-reader in our pocket, and people communicate to us via text instead of calling us, we read even more. The word has, strangely, as video games and movies and things have happened, the need for being able to communicate with the written word has grown even more important in our society. And it's become more and more important regardless of your occupation. And that's another thing that's happened, is, once upon a time, you were an engineer, or you're a construction guy with a hard hat, and you're like, I don't need those fancy word things. And now, our engineer in our hard hat has to produce these long page descriptions of what we're doing to get him through the board and stuff like that. He basically sits and writes essays all day. And it's really interesting to see how many people use the word and need the word. And I like that we have associations like this that are like, here's how to sharpen your sword. And so I would say this is a vital skill, and a vital skill to teach to people.
Fantastic. Let's give a big hand to Brandon Sanderson.
We are so fortunate